The M14 rifle feels wrong in Jake McNiece's hands. Its weight distributed differently than any weapon he's ever trusted his life to. Around him in the concrete bunker that serves as Camp 5's re-education facility, 24 American prisoners sit cross-legged on the frozen floor, each clutching the same unfamiliar rifle. The Chinese instructor's voice echoes off bare walls as he demonstrates proper disassembly technique for the third time this week. 3 months into captivity along the Yalu River, McNiece has learned to read the subtle signs of breaking among his fellow prisoners. Private Kowalski raises his hand too eagerly, desperate to please. Sergeant Rodriguez stares at his boots, jaw clenched against words that would earn him another week in isolation. The Korean War had scattered them across these mountains like seeds in winter soil, some taking root in whatever truth kept them warm, others withering under the constant pressure to forget who they'd been before. "You will appreciate this weapon's precision," the instructor continues in careful English, "unlike the crude instruments you carried before." McNiece's fingers move through the disassembly routine, while his mind drifts to weight and balance, to the satisfying heft of his Thompson submachine gun on a Dutch road in September 1944. That weapon had felt like an extension of his arm, as he and the filthy 13 moved through Market Garden's chaos, improvising demolitions when the careful plans dissolved under German counterattack. This M14 carries the sterile perfection of something designed in laboratories, tested on ranges where no one shoots back. The irony cuts deeper than the Manchurian wind howling through gaps in the concrete. Here sits a demolitions expert who once rigged bridges under fire, now forced to pretend enthusiasm for a rifle that represents everything clinical about modern warfare. The Chinese guards speak of technological advancement and ideological progress, but McNiece remembers when the best weapon was simply the one that didn't jam, when muscle memory and adrenaline took over conscious thought. "Sergeant McNiece," the instructor says, stepping closer, "share your impression of the gas system." McNiece looks up from the rifle's scattered components. Around him, fellow prisoners tense slightly, recognizing the moment when cooperation might slip into something more dangerous. "It's complicated," McNiece says quietly. Complexity indicates sophistication. Surely an experienced soldier appreciates superior engineering. McNiece reassembles the rifle with deliberate care, each component clicking into place with mechanical precision. When he finishes, he holds the weapon briefly, feeling its balance against his shoulder. "Complicated weapons break at complicated times," he says. "Simple ones just work." The instructor makes a careful note in his ever-present journal, while McNiece sets the rifle down with the same attention he once paid to handling unstable explosives. They can force him to hold their weapons and repeat their slogans, but they can't make him forget the difference between laboratory perfection and battlefield reliability. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The isolation cell measures 6 feet by 8 feet, with walls thick enough to muffle the sound of wind, but thin enough to let the cold seep through like water through limestone. McNiece sits with his back against the concrete, staring at frost patterns on the single small window. 3 days for questioning the M14's weight, a mild rebellion by any reasonable standard, but here every word carries the gravity of ideological resistance. His cellmate is Master Sergeant Frank Delano, a tank commander from the 1st Cavalry who made the mistake of comparing communist manufacturing unfavorably to Detroit assembly lines. Delano huddles in the opposite corner, conserving body heat and studying the ceiling as if it contains answers to questions neither man wants to voice. "You ever notice how they always talk about the weapon like it's the war?" Delano whispers after the guards pass. McNiece nods. During Market Garden, weapons had been tools, critical ones, but still just metal and wood that either helped you complete the mission or got you killed trying. The difference between his old Thompson and a captured German MP40 wasn't ideological. It was practical, measured in reliability under stress and familiarity when there wasn't time to think. Back home, they're probably telling stories about what we did, McNiece says, making it sound cleaner than it was. Delano shifts position, his breath visible in the frigid air. Think they'll understand what happened to us here? The question hangs between them like smoke. McNiece thinks about the weight of the M14, how it felt foreign not because it was enemy equipment, but because it represented a kind of warfare he didn't recognize. Clinical, precise, designed by engineers who'd never crouched in a ditch while mortars walked toward their position, never had to choose between following orders and keeping their squad alive. Through the small window, McNiece can see other prisoners moving between buildings under guard supervision. Some walk with the careful posture of men still fighting an invisible war. Others shuffle with the resigned gait of those who found peace in surrender, not to the enemy, but to the simple relief of not having to make impossible choices anymore. The guards return after nightfall, leading McNiece back to the main dormitory where his bunk waits among rows of others. Around him, fellow prisoners settle into evening routines, some writing letters that may never be sent, others lying quietly with their faces turned toward the walls. The building holds the particular silence of men carrying individual weights they can't share. McNiece pulls his thin blanket tight and closes his eyes, but sleep brings no relief from the questions that circle like aircraft in a holding pattern. What becomes of a soldier when the war ends, but the fighting continues in different forms? How do you explain that sometimes the hardest battles aren't against enemy positions, but against the version of yourself that others expect you to become? The morning brings news that travels through the camp like groundwater seeping through soil, quiet, persistent, impossible to contain. Sergeant Rodriguez returns from his individual consultation with news that American forces have pushed deeper into North Korea, that the war continues while they sit in concrete cells learning to appreciate enemy weapons technology. McNiece receives the information with the same careful attention he once paid to intelligence briefings before airborne operations. During Market Garden, news from other sectors had often arrived hours late and heavily filtered, forcing decisions based on incomplete pictures of larger battles. Here, information becomes another form of currency, traded carefully between prisoners who've learned to read between the lines of official announcements. "They're saying the war might end soon," Rodriguez whispers during the midday meal of thin soup and rice, talking about negotiations, prisoner exchanges. "They've been saying that for months," Delano replies, but his voice carries a note of hope that wasn't there yesterday. McNiece stirs his soup thoughtfully. Hope, he's learned, can be as dangerous as despair in a place like this. Better to focus on smaller, more manageable goals. Surviving the next re-education session, keeping Rodriguez from breaking under pressure, maintaining the quiet solidarity that keeps them all anchored to who they'd been before capture. The afternoon brings another weapons demonstration, this time focusing on proper maintenance procedures for the M14. The Chinese instructor moves between prisoners with practiced patience, correcting grip, adjusting stance, offering quiet praise for signs of ideological progress. McNiece participates with mechanical precision, his hands going through the motions while his mind travels elsewhere. He thinks about young soldiers who'll carry this rifle into future conflicts, men who deserve equipment chosen for effectiveness rather than political symbolism. The gap between theoretical superiority and practical reliability, between laboratory perfection and the brutal chaos of actual combat, where 19-year-olds make split-second decisions that determine who lives and who dies. "Sergeant McNiece," the instructor says, pausing beside him, "you seem more cooperative today." McNiece looks up from the rifle he's been cleaning with unnecessary thoroughness, just trying to understand the mechanism. Understanding leads to appreciation. Appreciation leads to acceptance. "Maybe," McNiece says quietly, "or maybe it just leads to more questions." The instructor studies him for a long moment, then moves on to the next prisoner. Around the room, men continue their careful dance between cooperation and resistance, each finding his own balance point between survival and surrender. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The breakthrough comes during a routine evening inspection when Private Kowalski finally snaps. The kid who'd been trying so hard to please, who'd raised his hand eagerly during weapons demonstrations, suddenly throws his M14 across the dormitory and starts screaming about Detroit assembly lines and American manufacturing superiority. The sound echoes off concrete walls like artillery in a valley, sharp and impossible to ignore. McNiece watches from his bunk as guards swarm Kowalski, restraining him with practiced efficiency. But something in the kid's wild-eyed desperation strikes deeper than simple breakdown. This is what happens when the pressure to cooperate finally exceeds a man's ability to bend without breaking, the moment when survival tactics collapse into genuine crisis. He's been holding that in for weeks, Rodriguez whispers, as they drag Kowalski toward the isolation cells. McNiece nods, remembering other young soldiers who'd carried too much weight for too long without release. During Market Garden, he'd seen paratroopers freeze under fire not from cowardice, but from the accumulated pressure of making life-and-death decisions without adequate rest or relief. The human mechanism, like any weapon system, had its breaking point. The next morning brings changes to their routine. The weapons demonstrations continue, but with added emphasis on psychological evaluation. Prisoners are asked to write detailed comparisons between American and communist manufacturing philosophies to explain how superior technology reflects superior social organization. McNiece stares at the blank paper for 20 minutes before writing a single sentence. The best weapon is the one that works when everything else fails. The instructor reads it carefully, makes notes in his journal, then calls McNiece forward for individual discussion. They sit across from each other at a small wooden table, the M14 lying between them like evidence in a trial neither man really wants to conduct. "You resist ideological progress," the instructor observes. "Why?" McNiece considers the question seriously. "Because I've seen what happens when people start believing their tools are more important than their purpose." "Explain." "Weapons are just metal and wood. Men win wars. Good men with simple weapons beat bad men with complicated ones every time." The instructor leans forward slightly. "Yet you carried advanced weapons in your war, Thompson submachine guns, plastic explosives, radio equipment. Because they were tools that did their job." McNiece pauses, choosing his words carefully. "We didn't worship them. We just used them to get home." For the first time in 3 months, the instructor's composure cracks slightly. Something in McNiece's tone, not defiance exactly, but an unshakable certainty, seems to bypass his ideological training and hit something more fundamental. "You will continue weapons instruction," the instructor says finally, "until you understand." "I understand fine," McNiece replies quietly. "That's the problem. The real breakdown comes not from Kowalski's dramatic collapse, but from the quiet erosion that follows. Days blend into weeks as prisoners cycle through weapons demonstrations, ideological discussions, and individual consultations that probe for signs of conversion or resistance. McNiece watches fellow Americans adapt in different ways, some genuinely embracing their captor's worldview, others playing along just convincingly enough to avoid punishment, still others withdrawing into silent endurance. But the secret McNiece carries, the thing he's never shared even with Rodriguez or Delano, has nothing to do with weapons or ideology. It's simpler and more devastating. He's starting to forget. Not the big things, his name, his unit, his mission during Market Garden, but the small details that once seemed permanently etched in memory, the exact weight of his Thompson submachine gun, the sound of detonation cord hissing before an explosion, the faces of men from the Filthy 13 who didn't make it home. Each day in captivity seems to wear away another small piece of the soldier he'd been, replacing it with something more compliant, more manageable. The M14 has become familiar in his hands now. When the instructor calls for disassembly, McNiece's fingers move through the routine without conscious thought. When asked to compare it favorably with previous weapons, he can generate the required responses almost automatically. The rifle no longer feels foreign. It feels like just another tool, stripped of the emotional weight he'd once attached to such things. "You're adapting well," the instructor observes during one of their individual sessions. "Your reports show significant ideological progress." McNiece nods, recognizing the truth in the statement. He is adapting. The question that haunts his sleepless nights isn't whether he's cooperating, but whether the cooperation has become genuine. When he praises the M14's engineering, is he just playing along, or has some part of him actually started to believe it? "The war will end soon," the instructor continues. "Prisoners who demonstrate proper understanding will be repatriated quickly." What about the others? Others may require additional instruction. McNiece thinks about Kowalski, still in isolation 3 weeks after his breakdown. About Rodriguez, whose cooperation has become increasingly genuine as the months drag on. About Delano, who no longer questions anything, just follows instructions with the blank efficiency of a well-maintained machine. "What happens when we go home?" McNiece asks. The instructor smiles slightly. "You return as better soldiers, more educated, better able to serve your country with proper understanding of technological advancement." That night, lying on his bunk in the dark dormitory, McNiece stares at the ceiling and tries to remember the exact sound of his Thompson's bolt cycling. But the memory feels distant, overlaid with newer sounds. The click of the M14's safety, the instructor's patient explanations, the scratch of pencils on paper during ideological assessments. The real terror isn't that they're breaking him. It's that they're succeeding so quietly he can barely tell the difference. The prisoner exchange comes in March, sudden and bureaucratic as a change in weather. McNiece stands in a processing line with 24 other Americans, each clutching a small bundle of personal effects returned after months of safekeeping. His contains a wallet with pictures he'd forgotten, a watch that stopped running sometime during his first week in captivity, and a letter from home that he can't bring himself to reread. The Chinese guards are professional and efficient, checking names against lists, stamping papers, maintaining the careful courtesy that marks official handovers. The same instructor who'd conducted their weapons demonstrations offers formal farewells, expressing hope that their educational experience will serve them well in future military service. McNiece accepts the handshake without comment. What could he say? "Thank you for teaching me to doubt my own memories. Thank you for showing me how easily convictions dissolve under sustained pressure." The polite fiction of educational exchange works only if both sides maintain it, and McNiece lacks the energy for anything more honest. The bus ride south takes 8 hours, winding through mountain passes where snow still clings to shadowed slopes. Fellow ex-prisoners sit quietly, each lost in private thoughts about the transition from captivity to freedom, from controlled routine to uncertain futures. Some seem genuinely grateful for their experience, talking quietly about lessons learned and perspectives gained. Others stare out windows with the hollow expression of men who've lost something they can't name. Rodriguez sits beside McNiece, occasionally pointing out landmarks or attempting conversation that dies before it develops momentum. The easy camaraderie they'd shared during their first weeks in camp has been replaced by something more cautious, as if neither man trusts the other's transformation. "Think they'll understand what happened to us?" Rodriguez asks as they approach the exchange point. McNiece considers the question he's been avoiding for weeks. "I'm not sure I understand it myself." The American officials who process their return are thorough but gentle, conducting medical examinations and brief interviews that focus more on physical health than ideological impact. McNiece answers questions about treatment, food, living conditions, and political pressure with careful honesty that reveals nothing about his internal struggles with memory and conviction. 6 months later, McNiece sits in a diner in Oklahoma City, watching traffic pass while he nurses coffee that's gone cold. The M14 has become standard issue for American forces, just as his Chinese instructors predicted. Young soldiers carry it with the confidence of men who trust their equipment, who believe in technological advancement and superior engineering. But McNiece remembers weight and balance, the feel of unfamiliar metal against calloused palms, the slow erosion of certainty under sustained pressure. He thinks about weapons as symbols rather than tools, about the human capacity for adaptation that can be either strength or surrender, depending on circumstances beyond individual control. The waitress refills his cup without being asked, a small kindness that feels heavier than it should. McNiece nods his thanks and returns to watching traffic, thinking about the distance between legend and memory, between the stories people need to believe and the truths that some men carry alone. If this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.